made with expanded PTFE that's in filtration. It's obviously in breathable clothing like Gore-Tex, but there's a whole industry where they have, what are they called? They're essentially like a vacuum cleaner bag, but on an industrial scale, and they're flue, I can't think of the name of it, but think about a coal-fired power plant. They've got big, obviously, effluent of airflow from the power generating plant, and so they've got these gas flue bags that filter out the particulates as part of the abatement process from the power plant. Flue gas bags, or I'm sorry, I'm trying to think out loud as we go here, but that's starting to get into maybe you're acquiring the expertise and the entree to that side of the market. It's not going to be necessarily a core competency that you have in-house if you're dealing with PFA and those related industries.
Okay.
So that would be the value of acquisition, is you're buying that core competency for other markets that you're not touching with PFA.
Okay. Well, that makes a lot of sense.
I mean, you still have buying power with the manufacturers because you're buying more fluoropolymer, so there's some synergy there, and you're expanding your reach into other segments that you're not participating in.
Okay. No, that makes sense. If we can turn now and talk about trends, major trends that are impacting, let's talk about major trends that are impacting the market for PFE. The market for PFA. And these can be trends that are impacting either the demand for finished products, or on the supply side, either the resin or the manufacturers. So let's talk about trends from a PFA perspective first, and after that, then we can talk about trends across the fluoropolymer market.
Okay. Obviously, we've already talked about the main trend, and that is making integrated circuits and wafers, loading more on them, processing bigger diameter wafers, so the whole development of, capacity around semicon wafer processing is, obviously the biggest trend related to semicon. They're obviously cramming more circuitry on smaller space, and they're trying to process bigger and bigger diameter wafers, and so that technology shift creates the demand for the semicon. In CPI, any industrial segment that uses fluoropolymers, it's GDP. Your other guy, the 30-year guy, probably is well aware of the fluoropolymer industry is a great lagging indicator of economic growth or decline around the world by about 6 months. You can track it like clockwork. The global economy's growing rapidly. 6 months, you'll see that impact in fluoropolymer demand, and vice versa. That affects all the fluoropolymer segments. I had a third one specific to PFA. On the medical side, healthcare industry is growing pretty steadily, so that would probably be a little bit higher growth rate than just GDP. That's probably pretty much it for that.
Okay. All right, so we've got semiconductor, we've got the shift to larger wafers. Secondly, we've got fluoropolymers as a lagging indicator of essentially GDP.
Correct.
And then thirdly, we've got medical growth. Any other major trends impacting either PFA or fluoropolymers in general?
Not that I can think of. There was a problem 15 years ago or so where China, who the source of the best quality fluorospar, which is a mineral that starts the value chain for fluoropolymers, they started restricting exports. We're trying to grow the downstream business internally within China, and so all the manufacturers had to qualify other sources. That's happened. Get it from Mexico, South Africa, Vietnam. So there was a lot of turmoil in pricing for spar during that previous time, and once they all qualified them, it's stabilized. Very reasonable incremental cost increase or flat, and so there's no current trend that I'm aware of. And natural gas is cheap, so the energy is one of the big components of the cost of making fluoropolymers. So really good from a supply side for fluoropolymers. Probably the only other potential, and it hasn't happened in a while, but some of the late entrants into the fluoropolymer industries in China, particularly, there'd be a plant going up once a year, where that would kind of rock the industry for a while temporarily. In fact, one of DuPont's joint venture plants in Japan didn't have an explosion, but they had an issue, and that actually impacted PFA, because that's where half the PFA is made for the Chemours side of the industry. So that that's a temporary thing, but one of those plants, they're very high capital intensive, very hazardous, high pressure, high temperature processes. So if something goes wrong, it's usually 8 months to a year before that facility's back running. Daikin had a similar problem 10 years ago, and so that's kind of an ad hoc or a one-off, but it impacts supply, especially in the case of PFA, because Daikin and Chemours probably make, I'm going to say, 60 or 70% of the PFA today.
50 to 70%?
Yeah, I'd say a big chunk, a majority, clearly a majority of the PFA is made by Daikin or Chemours. And so, they've got an asset in Japan. Chemours got one in Japan. They both have one in the U.S. So there's 4 main assets in the world producing at least 60% of the PFA, if not more. So if one of those goes down, then you're going to get a disruption in supply for the short term, 6 months to a year. But knock on wood, I'm not aware of any accidents anybody's had in the last 5 or 10 years.
Okay, that makes sense. So a follow-up question. I had one expert say, hey, supply is limited to a handful of plants around the year. Demand is clicking along at a pretty good clip. So that would suggest that pricing for PFA resin is going to continue to have pricing pressure over the foreseeable future. Is that something that you would agree with, disagree with, nuance? What would be your reaction to that kind of a comment?
When you say pricing pressure, you mean to increase price of resin?
Yeah. If PFA demand is growing at 8% per year or something significant over GDP, however, there are only a handful of main PFA plants around the world, what is the impact to price and availability?
Yeah. Again, it's determined, I think, by the ebbs and flows of the semicon market. There's favorable situations for the manufacturer of the PFA when it's going wide open and a lot of fabs being built. But then during those troughs, I think there's available capacity today. So it's kind of a feast or famine. That's not the right term, but clearly the ability to raise price for the manufacturer is there when there's high activity in semicon, because it just dominates.